Wow. All right. Okay. Eve, let me say hello to Eve. Are you there?
Hello. I'm here. Hello.
Good. All right. We're just going to get started. We'll just wait one more minute and I'll do a formal welcome to everybody, and then we'll get started. I love your library behind you there. Is that a virtual library?
No, it's mine. My Zoom room, especially. Never thought I'd have one of those.
You should get a small trophy and place it on one of the shelves. And then if someone says to you, "What was the trophy for?" you say, "Oh, that's where I came in last place at the Tiddlywinks competition or something."
Just one little technical note for everyone. I'm going to mute everyone's microphones, and then I will unmute Jeff and Eve. So just so no one panics.
Unmute. All right. Okay, we're already recording, aren't we, Matthew?
Everything's all set to go.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's our first evening, Canadian Tour Guide Association of British Columbia Zoom meeting, the 18th one overall. We have done a bunch of others of these with a number of guest speakers, including former Vancouver Tourism CEO Rick Antonson and people like Charles Gauthier and John Atkin, the famous local historian here in Vancouver. I'm leaving out a whole pile of people, but we'll post on the chat in a few minutes our YouTube channel for the Canadian Tour Guide Association, and you'll be able to watch almost all of them. This one will eventually be on there in a day or two. So my name is Jeff Vino here in Vancouver, and let's see here, October 29th, 2020. And we do have, in addition to our guest speaker tonight, we have hopefully some other members of the various tourism Facebook groups in the Vancouver area or Seattle. Just out of curiosity, is anyone besides Robin, who's all the way in the United Kingdom, do we have anyone in Washington State who's with us tonight? You can unmute or type in the chat. Alberta, Washington, we know we've got Vancouver people, but if you're from one of the other places in the province, give us a quick turn on your mic real quick and say hi, or do it in the chat. Oh, I just missed something that was in the chat there. Calgary. All right. And I know we have a lady who is over in Germany. Last month, we did a Zoom meeting where we invited folks from all over the place. And she's a member of the British Columbia, Alberta Facebook group here in the Vancouver area. Okay, let's say hello to Eve. Eve, I understand we like to start off with all of our guests by finding out a little bit more about you. I know from reading your website, evelazarus.com, that you're originally from Australia. Which part? I've been there twice, by the way. Been to Australia twice.
Have you? I'm from mostly from Melbourne, but also small town Yarrawonga, which is on the border of New South Wales and Victoria on the Murray River. We
were just down there again about 2 years ago. I have a friend in the Gold Coast. So we were all around Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, back down again as far as Sydney and towns in between. I wanted to get back to Melbourne, but we were running a little shy on time, even though we were there in total 6 weeks. I have a friend of mine who's an ITMI graduate. He's in Adelaide, but I don't think he's on this call tonight. So how did you go from being in the Melbourne area to where did you eventually get to and before getting here?
I pretty well came over for a couple of weeks on my round the world trip back in about 1984 and never left, really.
All right. And when you were graduating high school, were you, did you sort of know you wanted to become an author, or actually, didn't I read something about you used to work for the Vancouver Sun? Were you a reporter?
I did. I was a business reporter for the Vancouver Sun back in the 90s, early 90s.
Wow. Okay. I'm just writing that down. we've had reporters, but not business reporters. So you were in the world of finance, or you were involved, you were interested in it?
Yeah, pretty much. I worked at the Vancouver Stock Exchange back in the late 80s, I guess.
Wow.
That
There
was
were a lot of there were a lot of stories there, because I understand it was one of the shadiest in the North America, right?
Well, apparently so. Yeah, I was in public relations, no less. And when Forbes magazine came out with calling us I think it was the scummiest. What was it? It was a great quote. Something sleaziest stock exchange in the world. No, scam capital of the world. Or the universe. I can't remember now, but it wasn't a fine time.
Did you get to meet Murray Pezim?
No, I never did. I never did meet Murray Pezim.
Oh well, no big deal.
No stories there.
So, did your writing for the Sun, is this what eventually led to books, or did you start out with other stories for magazines, and how did it lead to getting to become an author? You've got quite a list of books. I'll ask you about some of them in a few minutes.
I kind of fell into it. I had 3 kids, and so I went freelance in the 90s and worked for a bunch of trade magazines. I was a Vancouver correspondent for Marketing Magazine, and did a bit of freelance work. And I just remember reading this article in the Vancouver Sun back in around 2002. It was this tiny little article, and it mentioned James Johnston. I don't know if any of you know James. He's a tour guide, lives in Strathcona. And they talked about James being a history detective or a house detective, and how, people would hire James to research their house and tell them, everyone that lived there and events that had happened there, and put it in the context of the neighborhood. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting. I'd love to write about this. And I was never particularly interested in history before that, but I just thought, what an interesting idea. So I called up James and said, I'd love to hear more about it. And he said, come over to Strathcona. And he took me for a tour, and he would say, this house over here was a brothel, and this was a bootlegging, and this was a sausage factory, and Katie Lang lived here in the 70s. And I was hooked. I just love this idea that a house had a social history or a genealogy like a person did. And so I started writing these articles, and just about everyone I pitched to bought some kind of variation of this story that and featured kind of James. And then I found other people like James across the country and wrote about some of their stories. And I thought, oh, I've got a book. And so, a couple of years went by, and a couple of hundred rejections came. And finally, Brian Kaufman at Anvil Press. Can you see that at home?
Yes, yeah.
Right. So that was my first book, At Home with History, and it was kind of based on this whole idea that a house has a story. And so I started blogging, because what happened, I would have, people would write in and say, oh, you've written about Uncle Joe, the bootlegger, and they'd send me Uncle Joe's bootlegging card, or Granny had a brothel, and they'd tell me stories about Granny, or some corrupt cop that they were related to, or something like that. And I had nowhere to put them. And so I was starting to get this really neat sort of repository, I guess, of other people's history. And sometimes someone would scan a photo in their album and send it over. And I thought, wow, this has never been seen outside the family album. So I started my blog, Every Place Has a Story, and just got really obsessive about it. I wrote about it every week, and wrote about different stories. I called it sort of history and heritage houses and murder. And but it was really anything that I found interesting, and other people did too, and they kept adding to these stories. So about a year and a half ago, I guess, I realized that I was coming up to 500 stories, and this year was my 10th anniversary. And I said to my publisher, Brian, Lamb at Arsenal Pulp Press, at that point, I'm thinking of self-publishing a little book, just a little book on my blog. And he said, I think we'd like to do that for you. And they did. And here it is, Vancouver Exposed. Searching
wow.
History.
Well,
and I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it's like a telephone book. It's just gorgeous inside. It's full of, I've got 309, I actually counted them, photos from then and now, and some of archival, and some of menus and postcards, and just really stuff that was really, I think, interesting. And, you know, I could add, I've got this house on Thurlow and Alberni, and someone had sent it to me, and they had their great grandparents standing outside this house in 1894, I think it is. And, you know, that's in the book, and they're standing outside their house with these crazy bikes that they rode around Stanley Park. And so I researched that corner, and it's just this fascinating history that ended up turning into Oil Can Harry's, if anyone remembers that. And all these clubs and all of this, and now it's the Carlisle, this huge condo building. But a lot of that theme of then and now, and the evolution of certain areas. I'm guessing that some of you recognise the building on the cover, do you? They can't talk to me, can you?
That looks like the old Burke's building at Granville in Georgia.
Well done. Yes, it is. It's a Burke's building. And the first story is actually the story of the funeral of the Burke's building in 1974. Heritage advocates, of course, were outraged that we're pulling down this absolutely beautiful building, and held a mock funeral for it. And we love that sort of image of the Burke's building, and you can see kind of behind it, Jazz, the designer's gone, and she's taken a photo of the Scotia Tower and the London Drugs building that's replaced it. And then she's kind of ripped it like a collage to sort of give that feeling that we're peeling back the layers in the book, which is really what I've tried to do a lot in there.
What was your that's your latest book, which I do want to get to. What was your first book? You were probably most famous for the Murder by Milkshake, which was out about a year ago. Yes, and but I'm curious to ask you about Sensational Vancouver, and you've got a book on Sensational Victoria.
I do.
What is the ground you cover in those two books? Yeah, show them both. We have members of our association in various parts of the province, including Victoria. And many of us, I don't know if you saw that email I sent you about 20 minutes before we started about where a city tour goes in Vancouver.
Oh, I didn't know.
But that's all right. Often a lot of us here also do the Victoria Day trip, where we'll go over on the ferry, go to Butcher Gardens, and get folks downtown. Of course, downtown Victoria is much smaller, but when you have time to do a proper tour of the area, it's well worth it. So what do the Sensational Victoria and Vancouver books cover?
Well, Sensational Victoria was my second book, and it's not in color like the news one, but you can see there's just tons. It's packed full of photos, and again, it's got that kind of then and now flavor. And the first chapter is kind of 1913 doing the James Bay tour and downtown tour in the footsteps of Emily Carr, and we've kind of done I'll see if I can find the map quickly, but yeah, we had this great map. Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
Right. And this great sort of map done up so people could actually, get the book and actually walk around and see some of these buildings. And as you know, James Bay, there are so many, some of the pictures there of them, but there's so many of the buildings that are still there. And it's just such a fantastic area to walk around. And it was Emily Carr's house, of course, of all sorts.
Yeah.
And so there's a real sort of flavour of then and now. And I talked to a lot of the homeowners and got that sense of history of, Emily Carr in 1913 and they're living in the house now. Samuel McClure houses and James Bay Inn. And of course, then we couldn't do James Bay Inn and Emily Carr without doing these ghost stories. I drop around to people's houses and say, "Hi, I'm Eve. I've come to research your heritage garden, or talk about your architect, or talk about this famous woman that lived in your house." And they'd say, "Oh, you haven't come to talk about our ghost." And I say, ghost, you've got a ghost. That's fantastic. So there's a chapter on murder in the houses and ghosts, because you can't have one without another. And Victoria, as I didn't know until I started researching this book, is the most haunted city in BC, if not Canada. And the lovely thing with, especially now it's Halloween, the lovely thing with people in Victoria is they just embrace their ghosts. And they're very proud of them, unlike us in Vancouver, because we're so worried it'll bring down the price of our real estate that we don't talk about them.
Yeah, I was telling someone a story today about a so-called haunted house on Cambie and King Edward, which the story was made up by a real estate agent because he got forced out of the sale. And another real estate agent was brought in. So we started a story about the house having had a murder in it, knowing that a lot of the Asian community would not be interested in the house if that were the case. So, and I don't know if you caught it somewhere today on CKNW. I think it was Mike Smith did about 10 minutes with Will Woods of Forbidden Vancouver.
Oh, Will, yes, a good friend.
Will is going to is got sold out nights just ahead, but does have some openings for his Gastown walking tours and all the weird and strange stories that happened. We've been trying to get Will as one of the guests. I don't know if you know his brief story. He was.
I know Will really well. We did a book together, actually. Yeah.
Oh, which one was that?
Vancouver Confidential.
Oh, okay. Will started out being, he was just a spectator or a passenger on a walking tour and got the idea to do his own thing.
Yeah, they're fabulous. I've been on a few of his tours.
So. Yeah, oh yeah. He's come to a couple of our, when we used to be able to hold in-person meetings monthly up until this past spring. Yeah, Will's a great guy. So any of you who don't know Will Woods and Forbidden Vancouver, I think it's forbiddenvancouver.com. It's well worth visiting. So the Vancouver book, the Vancouver Sensational, is the same thing, stories about neighborhoods and such?
Yeah, it's more sort of, the first book, At Home with History, is very much sort of geographically spaced out. And Sensational Vancouver was more about the chapters on the madams, and I've called one Social Evil. And I got into a lot of legendary women. So it wasn't just crime. It was sort of stories that I felt hadn't been covered, women that I'd never heard of. People like Valerie Jerome, Harry Jerome's sister. Of course, everyone's heard of Harry, but not a lot of people had heard of Valerie. And I thought that was a real shame because she was an amazing athlete. Tosca Trasolini, amazing person. She was Angelo Branca's secretary, Supreme Court judge, and she was also a pilot and an incredible athlete. Nellie Yip Kwong from Strathcona. She worked with the Chinese and had birthed 500 Chinese babies in this Strathcona house. There's a picture of her with some of the kids. She was just this incredible, amazing woman. She was a white woman, but just fought for the rights of Chinese Canadians. And
isn't that terrible? I listen to the news all the time. I know a lot of the stories, but I've not heard of her. Is that house still standing?
It is. There's a picture there of one of the girls she adopted, actually. And it was funny because the current homeowner was there one day and he saw this woman peering into his living room, and he came out and he said, "Can I help you?" And she said, "Oh, I was born in this house." And then she told him the story of Nellie Yip Kwon. And he'd found sort of lots of things. Jimi Hendrix's grandmother had lived in the house briefly before. They're much more well known for another house on East Georgia, but they'd also lived in this particular house briefly as well. But there were just, so many incredible sort of stories. I've got, I really veer off the track here, and I've got a chapter on West Coast modern because I love West Coast modern architecture. And you'll recognise the BC Electric building that Selwyn Pullen took back in, when was that taken? 1957.
Yeah, the building was just brand new at that point, pretty much.
It was brand new. Yeah, there it is on the back cover as well. Yeah. And Fred Varley's house. I live in Lynn Valley in North Vancouver, and Fred Varley's house is just like a 5-minute walk from me. And I was fascinated with his life story and how that came about. So
why does his name ring a bell? I know the name, but now I can't place. Fred was who again?
Group of 7 artists.
Oh, I should know that. My wife used to be a painter. I should know that.
Oh, yeah.
And okay, let's. We're all. I'm eager to hear more about your current book, the Vancouver Exposed: Searching for the City's Hidden History. What hidden history in particular were you looking for, which I know led to things you weren't expecting to discover?
A lot of it has just come about because of things that people have sent me or photos that I might have come across and wanted to explore. I could pretty well. Chuck Curry's house. Are you familiar with that on Lake 3rd?
Chuck Curry. I know the name Chuck Davis, but not Chuck Curry. Oh, look at that house. Yeah.
Chuck Curry was a chef, and several years ago, he was doing the ads for White Spot as one of the celebrity chefs. Anyway, I'd written a story on my blog about spite houses. And you know what spite houses are? They're built, basically, it's a house or it's an add-on to a house that's put there to piss someone off. You know, it could be a neighbour with a barking dog, could be City Hall. There's some great examples in the States where heritage commissions wouldn't allow one homeowner to build a porch on his heritage house. So he painted it green with purple spots just to spite them. And the Sam Key in Chinatown, the narrowest building, that's a spite house, of course, because he built that when the city expropriated some of his land. But after I did that post, it got a really good reaction from people. But John Belshall wrote to me and he said, you know, there's a house on Lakewood and 3rd, and it's white with these giant red polka dotted spots. Is that a spite house? And I said, oh, that's fantastic. I'll go over and find out. So I drove over and knocked on the door, and Chuck Curry opens, and he's actually wearing, I've got the photo of him, let's see if I can show you, wearing his working whites. He was on his way to work at White Spot, and he even had his name tag. And I was kind of a bit stunned because I'd just seen him on a television commercial. I said, oh my God, you're Chef Chuck Curry. That's really hard to say if you try to say that really fast. And he was very gracious and gave me the story of his house. And I just thought that was really wonderful. We were talking a bit about people sending me photos from the album. I'll just see if I can find this quickly. It's it's not going to. Of course, I can't find anything.
It's okay. Take your time. We're okay for time.
Okay. What else? I can pretty well open it and find a story. This is another one on the back cover. Can you see the balloon? I'll see if I can get the big picture of it because that's really neat. And I'd come up with, where is it? Sorry, getting to it. I'll find it in a second. There it is. Now, can you see that?
Yeah, where's that again? Where's that taken?
That's a coach house in North Vancouver. See the guy jumping out, doing a belly flop? Yeah,
they used to do the belly flop used to be done there.
That's the one. So I saw this photo and was absolutely fascinated by it. You know, it sort of breaks every safety code you can possibly imagine. You know, you sort of think, whoa, what if it got some wind and it blew and this guy just went splattering on the side with all those people watching? Anyway, so I'd written this up on my blog and did a bit of research into this belly flop competition. And it actually started in 1975 at the Bayshore.
Yeah.
And it's done by a guy called Tom Butler, and he was this insanely clever PR guy. And he came up with this stunt with the world belly flop and cannonball diving competition, I think it was called. And it was just incredibly successful. And Andre the Giant, 7'4", came up from the States that first year and he won the competition. And by the next year, they had NBC and they had all these people trying to, you know, participate in it. And it was an incredible success. And it went on for a couple of years and then it moved to the Coach House Inn, where it continued to be this real success. So I wrote this story up on my blog, and a couple of weeks later, I get this comment from a guy called Trevor Rowe, and he says, "That's my dad jumping out of the hot air balloon." And he said his name was Kamikaze Bill. He was a logger from Bellingham. And little Trevor was only 4 years old when this was taken in 1979. But he remembers his dad, because I guess you wouldn't forget something like that, right? Your dad diving out of a hot air balloon would be hard to forget. Anyway, he remembers his dad stuffing weights in his T-shirt because he had to weigh 250 pounds to be able to participate. And he came in second. And I'll see if I can find this great photo of the woman who won here she is. The woman who won the women's dive was Fanny Annie. Can you see her? Isn't she wonderful?
Yeah.
450-pound stripper. And she used to come up
pounds.
Yeah, she used to strip at the Penthouse in the 70s. And she also apparently liked to belly flop. And so that was that story. So I've got tons of those sorts of quirky stories which really appeal to me. There was one about Van Tan, the nudist colony. Do you know?
Yes. Aren't they in North Van or something?
Yeah, it's just up the hill, about 5 minutes from here. And I'd heard about it because I've lived here for about 25 years. And I always thought it was an urban myth. And then I came across some story. I think they had a float in the Lynn Valley Days Parade or something strange. And I called them up and I said, "Oh my God, you're real. I thought you were an urban myth." And they said, "Oh, come on up and visit." So I did. And it turns out that they were founded in 1939, and they're the oldest nudist camp in Canada. And they've got about 7 acres at the top of Mountain Highway, and you have to wind around about 2 clicks to get up there. And it's obviously very secluded. And it's this just beautiful spot of land with a bluff that, overlooks Vancouver. And it's about, I think they've got about 100 members. And it's just like being with a, kind of middle-aged gardening group. It was quite interesting.
Yeah, they're still around.
They are, and I've got photos in the book that they kindly lent me. They had these historical photo albums. Let me just there's a couple of them. So dating back to the 50s, if you can see that.
That's
I'd taken a few myself, but they were quite wonderful looking at the buildings that were up there and from all that time. And that was a couple that I took when I was up there. So nothing really as much has changed. So it's kind of nice. It's got like the world stood still up the top of Mountain Highway.
Yeah. Wow. Tell our people who may not be familiar synopsis of the Murder by Milkshake, which of course is a very interesting tale of a former CKNW radio personality he was famous in the 50s as well as the 60s, or just the 60s?
60s. He started to get a radio presence around 1963. He did this weird thing, Clay 2 from Outer Space. He did these crazy promotions. And I'll just, for those of you that don't know the story, I'll just give you a brief rundown. Basically, Rene Castellani was a CKNW sort of minor celebrity, did all the promotions and some of the publicity. He used to do these outrageous stunts like the Maharaja from Alibaba, where he'd dress up as a sheik and go around handing out money for ratings and for CKNW. And people would be so incensed that they came out with signs saying "Keep BC British," and they actually fell for this, that he was going to buy BC. So he was a very, very good actor. Anyway, he was married to Esther Castellani, and he fell in love with Lolly, the 25-year-old station receptionist. So rather than divorce Esther, who, they both had an 11-year-old child at the time, he decided to poison her with arsenic-flavoured milkshakes, and which he nearly, so close, got away with it, except for the diligence with his doctor, who really liked Esther. I mean, like arsenic is a diabolically clever way to kill someone. but it's because it's really hard to detect. If it's given in small doses, it mimics like viruses and other natural illnesses. And it's very hard to detect without a special test. But this doctor had treated Esther for 7 weeks in hospital. And it was a horrific way to die. It's just really torturous. And he'd grown to really like her, and he wanted to find out how, what the cause of death was. And so he went right back over everything and finally realized that, might be arsenic. So he had her body exhumed, and they found up to, I think it was 1,500 times the normal amount of arsenic that's found in a human body in Esther's. And they thought, aha. And then they found out Renee was having this affair because he'd done for a clever man, he'd done some really stupid things. He'd taken out a mortgage in Lolly and his married names while Esther was still alive in a hospital. And the day after she died, he took Janine, their daughter, Lolly, and Lolly's son to Disneyland for a holiday. So people sort of, alarm bells went off that he really wasn't a good guy that he made himself out to be. But I'd written about this story in At Home with History just through the house in Kerrisdale where most of the poisoning took place, and hadn't really thought much about it. And then I wrote up a story on my blog, and I made this mistake. I said Lolly, his mistress, had a daughter. And this woman, Debbie, wrote to me and she said, oh, no, you're wrong. Lolly had a son. It's my husband, Don. And Don's been looking for Janine for 50 years. Do you know where she is? And I said, no, but I'd really like to find her. I'd love to talk to her. And then about a year later, Janine found me. She turned up at my book launch at the Police Museum. And it was for my book, Blood, Sweat and Fear. Just give it a plug, Blood, Sweat and Fear. Story of Inspector Vance. And here I am. There's a true crime exhibit for her mother in the police museum. And we turned the autopsy suite into a bit of a bar. So we had a cash bar going on there. And that's where her mother's body had been brought to when it was exhumed for the autopsy. So I'm standing there with my glass of wine meeting Janine. It was very surreal. So we met the following week, and she's the most lovely person in the world. Just amazing. She's got 2 daughters, and she's become a very close friend of mine. And really the book became her book. It's written from her point of view, and it just sort of tells a story. And my hope was to try to give Esther back her voice a bit, which was really taken from her in this whole story. It's always seems to be about Renee because he's such a kind of larger than life character.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken from hearing you on an interview, it was only because he had gone away for 2 weeks and she seemed to be getting better. But as soon as he came back, she got sick again. And was it the doctor or was it a detective that figured out, hey, wait a minute?
Well, I have to back you up because it is a wonderful story and you'll all know the landmark. He was doing a promotion on the Bomax sign. And the idea was...
on Broadway near
West Broadway, which is now the Toys R Us.
Toys R Us, yeah.
Yeah. So back then it was the car yard, the Bowl McLean.
Bowl McLean, yeah.
Yeah. And the promotion for CK&W was that Rennie was going to climb to the top of the sign, and they'd had scaffolding put up next to it and a car on top. And he'd stay there until every last car in the yard was sold. And he did. And he was up there for 9 days. And during this time, Esther got better in hospital. She started, her health got better. Everything started looking promising for her. And the day after he came down, he went and visited her, and then she just had this massive dose of arsenic, they found out later. So they were able to test her nails and her hair growth, and they could find that there was a period of about 9 days when there was no arsenic, which corresponded with the time he was up on top of the Bomax sign. So they kind of figured out then that it was all circumstantial evidence, but there was a lot of it.
Oh, God. Back to your Vancouver exposed book. So on tour, when we're doing a sightseeing tour, most of the tours start and finish downtown. And move around through various Vancouver streets, such as Georgia Street, maybe from the area of the Hotel Vancouver down towards the BC Place, move over to Chinatown, Gastown, Canada Place, maybe go over to Alberni Street or Robson Street, and then make their way to Stanley Park. Some of the buildings on Georgia Street or Burrard Street, were you able to ascertain any interesting tidbits from, say, I know that the Hotel Vancouver is another one of these places that talks about ghosts and so on, but were there any other sort of interesting stories you came across that aren't necessarily ghost related, but
well, to be fair, I only have one ghost story in this book and 2 murders. So, and there's a nice raid at the Wigwam Inn, but mostly it's history. I'm back to sort of local history with a bit of a seedy underbelly. But my favourite story on the Hotel Vancouver that's in there was there was an artist, Beatrice Lenny, and she was a sculptor. And she did this mural, let me see if I can quickly find it, for the Hotel Vancouver when it opened. And then they decided to redesign it. Here it is. And they walled it up. So behind the elevators in the lobby there, this mural is still there.
Oh.
And another story, which I really liked when I was digging around in this, was the building at 999, I think it's 999. Let me see, 900 West Hastings, that one?
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
There's another, this woman, there's a picture of Beatrice, by the way, in her studio. So you don't hear about women sculptors very often, and I thought that was pretty fascinating, that, the one we have, we've walled up. But she wasn't the only one. There was another quite well-known sculptor named Elsa Mayhew. Here we go. So I can't see. So you'll have to tell me if you can see that.
Yeah, she's just on the left side. Yeah.
Right. You see that size of the sculpture behind her? It was just huge. It was commissioned by the Bank of Canada when that building opened in 1967. Trying to find out how many tons it is quickly. But they paid $30,000 in 1967 dollars back then. And she was quite well known. Anyway, they commissioned this huge sculpture, weighed tons. I can't remember now how many tons it's in there. And then, let me see. Okay, she worked on it for 2 years. And she said when it finished, it fitted like a glove. So then fast forward 30 years, the building sold, and it sold to a Hong Kong-based investment group. You'll have to excuse me because it's been a while since I've done this story, so I've forgotten the details. Anyway, they wanted to renovate the lobby, and they found this, it just wasn't working with their new design. But they'd actually built the building around it. It's like this massive, massive bronze sculpture. So Eliza Mayhew was dead by then, but her daughter tried to get it donated to the Victoria Art Gallery. But, there's a he said, she said sort of story in this. She said they wouldn't cooperate and just walled it up over a weekend. And when I spoke to the building manager, who's still the building manager, 25 years later, he told me that wasn't true at all. They couldn't, basically couldn't afford to get someone out. It would have been such a massive undertaking to get it out of the building that they've just walled it up. So he promised it. She thinks it's been melted down. I love this story. And he says, no, it hasn't. It's still behind the wall. It's still right behind the wall in the lobby. And they've put up this other West Coast piece of art. So when you're going past, I couldn't get in with COVID, but at the back wall, apparently this sculpture is behind it, just walled up, waiting for another renovation, like a time capsule somewhere in the future.
Well, as you know, there's a couple of places locally, but especially the Hotel Vancouver, they did a number of renovations over the years. And one of the ones about 20, 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, they decided they were going to renovate again the lobby, and the workmen started pulling down the the facades that had been up over the years and went, hey, look at this. And then management came along and went, oh, that's better than what we were going to do. And they said, let's just put that back, uncover that, and but those of you that don't know that building, it's one of those the building she was just Eve was just talking about. That's pretty much at Hornby and Hastings. Yeah. It's a 10 or 12-story white building. You wouldn't give it a second look. And there's actually quite a number of interesting buildings all along there. The old Vancouver. The Terminal City Club's been torn down and a new building is in its place, but the Vancouver Club, the old Marine building is in that area. And many people don't go over to Hastings and Granville, where the Royal Bank building is. Across from the Burke's building, that's the Burke's building now, is the Royal Bank on that corner. And again, from the outside, it doesn't look like much, but when you just step in off of Hastings Street, it's like you're going back in time. The staircases, the upper and lower area, the main mezzanine floor, and so on. The old doors, the old gold doors, I think some of them are still there. So that's an amazing old part of town there. And of course, the Sinclair Center. But when you step in the Sinclair Center at Granville and Hastings, it's all been modernized for the most part. You see a few remnants of the old building, but not as much as what was there. Any other stories from the Vancouver Exposed book that are unusual or caught your attention?
Well, I'd like to think every one of them is. But it's funny you mentioned the Royal Bank building. I've got a story about the missing elevator operators. There's a lot of story. A friend of mine, Angus McIntyre.
Oh, yeah, we know. We had Angus as I know I've known him for about 30, 40 years, but we had him speak late last year or early this year before the last of our meetings was kiboshed by COVID. Transit driver. He drove the transit buses here in Vancouver for more than 40 years, and he retired about 5 years ago. But he took thousands and thousands of pictures, mostly on slides. And he now does a PowerPoint presentation.
20 of them are in the book.
Okay.
And he writes occasionally for my blog. In fact, on tomorrow, I'm just putting one down about 60th anniversary of the telephone exchanges. And he wrote one on the elevator operator. His one on my first story came directly from him. We held a funeral for the Burke's building. And that's Angus's photo. Can you see them with their videotape?
Yeah.
So I just love everything about this story. So here they are, and the protesters. Do you know the story about the Burke's building?
You go ahead and tell it. I know the story because I'm old now, but I know many of our. So I'll just quickly start you off. So the Burke's building used to be at Georgia and Granville, where the London Drugs and the Scotia Tower is now. And the Burke's building is a picture that Eve showed us a little earlier. It's that building there. Is that the back side of it? So it's on the same block. Oh yeah, there.
Isn't that
the
one? So
yeah, it's on the right side
there. The Burke's building. So you can see the Vancouver
clock. Yes. And put your finger again on the Strand Theatre, because that comes up from time to time. That was a movie theater, much like the original Capitol on Granville and Smythe there, Granville and Robson. And the Burke's building, that's not the best picture of the Burke's building, but it was a beauty. No. And unfortunately, the developers got their way and got it torn down. So now you pick up the story from there.
Yeah, so they couldn't do anything about it, the heritage advocates. So they held this mock funeral. And Angus was all of 26, and he rode down on his bike and brought his camera and just got these amazing photos like that one. And I ended up, this woman, this artist, was a woman called Evelyn Roth, and she used to go around to the video film studios and everything and get their used videotape. And then she crocheted these protest costumes out of it. And I ended up tracking her down in Adelaide, Australia. But so she's still crocheting videotape. So don't throw out your old videotape. So it was just a really interesting story to kick off the book, I thought, having it, because it could be today, really, couldn't it? you could see people having a funeral for taking down one of our heritage buildings. And there it is. Meet Me Under the Clock was a big deal, right on the corner there. And it was just such a travesty to replace this gorgeous building with the Scotia Tower and the London Times building.
Do you know the story of how it became, it's got dark windows, but it's got white columns on all four corners. Do you know how that came about?
No, I don't. No.
Well, what happened is, the second Hotel Vancouver, which was at Georgia and Granville, where the Nordstrom and Pacific Center Tower is now Toronto Dominion Tower, when they took the old second Hotel Vancouver down in 1949, that literally was a parking lot forever and ever and ever. And finally, in the early 1970s, they started to build Pacific Center with the taller of the two towers, the TD Tower being the first one. And at first, it was just this great big monolith with steel, no end of steel. Yeah, that tower there. But when the windows started going up and they were all dark, people just freaked out. And the city realized that's the second Hotel Vancouver there. That should never have been removed.
Oh, right? Insane.
But, so the TD Tower started going up, the steel structure, the windows went in. People just really flipped out when they realized this great big, tall, dark tower was going to be a blight on the skyline. And they were just furious. And they wanted something done. The smaller tower across the street from it, which almost nobody ever notices, has kind of a brown set of windows. But when the Vancouver Berks building came down and the Scotia Tower was proposed, they purposely made sure, and so did the city planning department, which by now was more in tune with what they didn't want. They added all those white columns. I don't think it's paint; it's white stone or something. Okay. And but the windows are still a bit darker, but at least it was more appealing than the old TD Tower. And of course, people weren't happy with Eaton's when it opened in 72, I want to say, and it was all white, as many people called it, a big white urinal. Thankfully, now that's all completely gone and redone now with Nordstrom in there.
Yeah, this was a picture that Angus took.
Yeah, there it is. There it is.
1974.
Yeah. Now, if you're looking at that building and you're thinking for the first time, hey, something's missing there, that's the original building. It didn't have the extra 2 floors added to it until about 10 years later.
That's right.
And they kind of came out and were kind of curvy, kind of but now you can't really see any of that because the whole building's been gutted and redone, interior and exterior.
He took this from the top floor of the Berks building, and you can see a bit of the edge there just before it came down. And you can see the Granville Mall going in. So I just think that's such an interesting shot. Yeah,
that would be about the mid-70s, the first part of the mall. Yeah. And the street was more... Hydro. Yeah, the old BC Hydro. Yeah.
Look how big it looks. Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Yeah, Angus has a friend named Jim who his parents took pictures several times in the mid to late 50s from the roof of the Hotel Vancouver. And the pictures are just astounding. I was trying to get a copy of them. I never did, but you've reminded me I need to ask Angus if he can get Jim to. Well, Angus has taken a lot of his slides and digitalized them. If I'm not sure if our president Marlene is on right now, but we need to get Angus back or see if we can get Angus to do a PowerPoint presentation via Zoom, because it's fascinating seeing old pictures of the city. Any other? Are you working on a new book by any chance?
I'm doing a podcast actually at the moment. I needed sort of a break away from books, and I am actually working on another book, but I've been plugging away at it for years. But the podcast is just a huge amount of fun. I wrote Cold Case Vancouver back in 2015, and it's unsolved murders, but it's very much entrenched in the times. And most of them you won't have heard of, but Babes in the Woods would be, everyone's heard of Babes in the Woods. And
the Stanley Park story of the children that were found, and that one's still cold.
Yeah, and although maybe not for long, they've sent away the DNA to one of these public ancestry type databases in the States. So through the coroner's office. So there's a possibility that they could identify them still. I live in hope. I think there's a chance. And I'll have a podcast coming up in a couple of weeks on that one. But it's just been so much fun because it's something I've never done this before. And it's just a different way of writing, of thinking. And I found a few retired detectives that worked on these unsolved cases that are talking to me. And I've got one coming up next week about Louise Wise, who was a 17-year-old girl killed in 1971. And he still thinks it could be solved, and he's coming on the podcast to sort of get it out, because the podcast, where the book just sells locally, the podcast goes everywhere. It's insane, the amount of, how popular these things are and where people are listening to them. So that's kind of my big passion at the moment. I've just finished one that's up on the moment, it's 1 murder and 3 ghost stories. So that was a lot of fun doing that one for Halloween.
Well, you should give us your address for your blog.
Yeah, it's all through my website, evelazarus.com.
All
and
right.
that's my blog, my podcasts, my books, my life.
All right. I know one of our coordinators, Matthew, there it is. Matthew just put it up now, evelazarus.com. So if you look on the chat, folks, and maybe, once we go off the air here, that'll disappear. So write it down or take a screenshot of it. If you're familiar with how to do your screenshots, you can capture that. Does anyone have any questions that I didn't think to ask? Go ahead to unmute your mic and speak up or add something in the chat. I'll just check the chat really quickly to see if I missed anything. Yeah, it's interesting. I never heard the term spite housing before, but definitely the old Jack Chow insurance building, or the Sam Key narrow building in Chinatown. Yeah, he got his property expropriated for the street being widened, and made a bet. The story is he made a bet. So you must have also met John Atkin, of course. And
of course, yeah. Actually,
did you ever?
Pictures in the book. John's pictures in the book, actually, with me at the Ovaltine Cafe, Judy Graves and Tom Carter. So he's in there, and he told me this great story about Maxine's. And he'd actually done a guest blog about Maxine's.
Is that the place on Davie and Bidwell?
Yeah.
Yeah, they saved the thought of that, but it's now an apartment building. Yeah.
Right. But the story's great, and John's version of the story, it's me interviewing John about the story. It's in there. And a lot of buried houses on the West End, that Denman block. One of them, I just sort of mentioned the Crystal Pool. Which is now the Aquatic Centre. If you go,
actually, some people get that wrong, Eve. The Crystal Pool was at the foot of Nicholas Street on Beach Avenue, and the Vancouver Aquatic Centre is a whole different building. The old Crystal Pool closed at 1974, just when the new building opened, May of 74. Yeah. I swam in that pool quite a lot as a kid.
Did you?
In the winter.
Did you know that's what it was supposed to have looked like?
Yeah, because when I saw the picture, I thought that's not quite it. It was more basic.
These were the plans for it. It was supposed to be a very swanky private club called the Connaught Beach Club. And there were plans for a ballroom and a roof garden and Turkish baths and a beauty salon and all sorts of things. And the Depression hit in 1929. They went broke, and the city of Vancouver took over the pool, which was the only thing that was finished. And that's how that sort of came about. But I just thought that was a really cool story.
So that's how it ended up being a bare bones building. Yeah. Oh, fantastic. I did not know that. Is that in the Vancouver Exposed book?
Yes.
Did you meet Chuck Davis, Vancouver author? Yes. Chuck Davis? Yes.
I did.
He and I were friends from the early 70s, and I contributed a couple of stories for the Vancouver book. Mostly the Greater Vancouver book, the one that came out in 97. And then his Metropolitan book in about 2010. Can you pull that Vancouver book quick? Because there's a number of new tour guides who have heard of that book, and they may not have
That's a new one.
That's the present day. Well, that's the one from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The history of Metropolitan Vancouver.
10 years old. There it is, Greater Vancouver book.
Right. And the original Vancouver book was black like that one, but it just said Vancouver book on it. So that was the first book was 76, and the one you just held up was 1997. All right. If there's no more questions, we're going to see if we can say hello to a few new people who are on here. Actually, I see Terry, Resno, Pejman, Naomi, Marion, Marina. Who's Lisa? Who's the Lisa that's on our screen there?
Well, I'm going to leave you now. So
thank you so much. We'll be in touch, and keep us by all means. Now that you have my email address, feel free to send me the odd email to say hello, and I'm doing this now, or that's happening, and so on. And I'll say hi to Angus for you.
Okay. And thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I'm glad it all worked out.